Thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Achille Roux. I'm an old friend and supporter of the CDE. I believe the CDE is making an important contribution to South Africa. They see their task as consolidating our democracy and showing the way to prosperity and growth for the whole country. CDE is 25 years old, nearly as old as the South African democracy. And I've been a long time supporter. I think we talk too little about reform and economic growth in South Africa. CDE tries to fill that gap. Part of what they do, and that is wonderful, is the ability to invite experts from overseas to talk to us in South Africa. I've been privileged to visit India on a few occasions. I've always been struck by the similarity between India and South Africa, many vast differences, but at the same time, it's a country that's with two countries with enormous potential and where there's a certain tension between politics and economic growth. Now, they've invited Montek Singh Ahluwalia this afternoon. He's described as a brilliant reformer, one of the people who helped create growth in India, and it's going to be a privilege to listen to him. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, CDE.
Great. Thanks very much, Michiel. It's my great pleasure, everyone, to welcome Montek Singh Ahluwalia to CDE Virtual today, and all of you. Thank you for joining us. I think everyone has read the short biography we distributed, but I want to stress the enormous achievements of which Montek and his colleagues, but Montek has been a central protagonist of the remarkable story of India of the last few decades. Now, he came from humble beginnings, went to the famous St. Stephen's College in Delhi, and then a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, and started a remarkable career at the World Bank. But in 1979, Montek decided to return home to India from Washington to work as a civil servant, and he became an increasingly senior member of the Indian government, culminating in the position of Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, which when I asked somebody in India rather naively who was the chairman, they told me it was the Prime Minister. So this was a really important position and had cabinet level rank, and a position he held from 2004 to 2014. Now in the 1970s, many people thought that India was destined to maintain the so-called Hindu rate of growth, about 3.5% per annum. It was seen almost as like an immutable law of nature that could not be changed. Now, this might sound a desirable rate of growth for South Africans, especially when you consider where we are now, but for India, with its rapidly expanding population and its desperate need to become a much more prosperous society for everybody. The remarkable thing is that progress happened, change actually occurred, and the government of India, armed with a clear diagnosis of what ailed the Indian economy and a firm commitment to implement reform, resulted in an acceleration of growth for about 20 years, from the early 1990s or starting in the late 1980s into the 90s, but really dramatically accelerating until about 2012. And so India's GDP grew at over 7% per annum in real terms from 1993 to 2012. And most importantly, poverty declined from 37% in 2004 to 22% in 2012. Some 138 million people were lifted out of absolute poverty. It was in this period that two economists, Finance Minister and then Prime Minister Montek Singh, and our guest today, Montek Ahluwalia, led the changes that transformed India, and in so doing, changed the world. And they accomplished this in a democracy, a fractious, opinionated, loud, diverse, and democratic federal state. Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, who will be speaking on this series in a few weeks' time, has said that the task that they achieved, or the sort of achievements in India, is perhaps a task in some ways more difficult than the phenomenal reforms that Deng initiated and nurtured in China. Now, like Michiel, whenever I go to India or read books about the subcontinent, I'm struck by the resonance with South Africa. This might sound ridiculous. After all, we're a country of about 60 million, and India is a subcontinent of 1.3 billion people. But so many debates sound so very, very familiar. And they've been so well trodden in India, in and about India, by so many leading academics in that country and elsewhere, and also by political and social movements. I'm therefore always struck by how much South Africans can learn from South Africa, from India, and its ongoing challenge to pull hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people out of unbelievable poverty. And so that's really what I want to concentrate on in our conversation today. The issues that dominate our two countries' debates and challenges that are so familiar. Now, my many informers in India, South Africa, and elsewhere who know Montek better than I do assure me that he is one of the great debaters of his generation and one of the wittiest people that they know. So our conversation today is an informal one, and I hope that you will feel free to share your true thoughts about the key ingredients for successful reform and its implementation, your disagreements with some of your critics on the left and the right, and now that you are no longer a senior member of government, provide a slightly less diplomatic perspective on India, its great achievements in the recent past, and what other countries might learn from your experience. So with those introductory remarks, I'm going to jump right in and start with this question. What do you think India did right in the late 80s and early 90s to get reform going? And how did this result in such dramatic and sustained growth rates for nearly 20 years? Montek.
Okay. Hi, can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, and thank you very much for your very kind remarks. Too kind, actually, but I won't go into that. Let me also take the opportunity, since you referred to my experiences, to hold up the book that I recently wrote. And I just hope that some of you who are deeply interested in the India story will get a chance to read it. I wouldn't say that what I say now, I think, would be broadly consistent with what is said in the book. But if it's not consistent entirely, it just means that I've learned a little more in the 1 year or so that has passed since I wrote the book. Now, your question of what did we get right? I mean, you're absolutely right in saying that we saw a kind of a structural break in our growth rate from the sort of 3.5, and then in the 80s it went up to 5.5, and then from the 90s onwards it went further up, and in the 2000s it kind of averaged 7% for quite a few years. I think what we got right was the recognition that economic policy had got locked into a sort of a time warp. I mean, we were running systems which were sort of inherited from past ideas and didn't really learn from how the world was changing. Some of these ideas were in themselves needed to change. I mean, for example, a lot of our thinking was based on the assumption that the dominant role in development would be played by the state as an investor. So, the role of the public sector. I mean, this was not consistent with the tremendous potential that Indian private sector had. The suspicion of the private sector had led to excessive controls over the private sector. And there was also controls over foreign investment, foreign trade, foreign technology, and so on. And I think we built, after a lot of internal discussion, there came to be a kind of a technocratic consensus that we needed to change. In the 1980s, that change was very incremental. We had a big crisis in 1991, a sort of balance of payments crisis. And the way things worked by then, people had worked out that we needed to make big changes, and the government of the day, which had Manmohan Singh as finance minister and prime minister was Mr. Narasimha Rao, they used that opportunity to put in place pretty broad-ranging changes. So I think the first instance of systemic change in policy came in 1991. And I think those changes were broadly in the direction of opening up the economy, giving more scope for the private sector, removing dysfunctional government controls, opening up to foreign trade, opening up to foreign investment, opening up to foreign technology. But you know, it was not done in a kind of a big bang sort of way. It was done a little more gradually. And I think it paid off. And the result is that over time, we saw a steady increase in the growth rate. And we benefited, as you said. India's growth at 7% per annum meant a hugely faster increase in per capita income. I mean, in the 1970s, our per capita income was growing a little over 1%. In the 2000s, it was growing at something like 5.5%. And that makes a huge difference to an economy, to structural change, to poverty, and all that kind of stuff.
Great. Well, thank you. Perhaps I can ask you this question before we get on to reform more fully. There's some people who would say that in that early set of reforms that you introduced that had so much impact were in a sense stopping the government from interfering in many ways. It was getting bureaucrats out of the economy, but that you stopped short of getting into the second generation of reforms or institutional building that was required for India to continue and sustain growth for an even longer period. How do you respond to that question about second generation reforms, or that you did the easy stuff but didn't kind of in the latter period move to the more the harder kinds of reforms? What's your perspective?
I think that's substantially correct. I mean, when we first started the reforms, we had a whole pile of things which actually just involved stopping the government from doing dysfunctional things. And those are what I would call stroke of the pen reforms. I mean, the government used to introduce licensing before you could do any investment, you abolish that. So there was a whole bunch of reforms which were easy to do once you developed a political conviction that you want to do it. Now, when you unleash the private sector, you then new constraints come up, and those constraints also require reforms. But those reforms are more difficult to do because they involve institutional change. I mean, let's take the simplest possible thing to think about. I mean, you stop the government from interfering too much with the private sector, and you get a burst of growth. As you get a burst of growth, there's a demand for skilled labor. So you really need to have a system that will generate a good supply of skilled labor. That's not so easy to do because the supply of skilled labor is not held up by stroke of the pen reforms. It's actually held up by building an effective educational system, which is going to take 10 years before it actually has effect. Similarly, as you unleash the private sector, you need to build in mechanisms where competition is maintained in the market. Now, some of that is through through competition with foreign imports, but a lot of that also relates to regulating industries so that they don't misuse market power. That's very complex, even in developed countries. You need to set up new regulatory institutions. Basically, it's much more difficult. It's not actually that we didn't do it. We did actually put that on board, but our progress in those areas was very slow. And I think we also didn't complete some of the first generation reforms, and we took too long in getting them done. I mean, in my book, I make the distinction between, Big Bang reforms and gradualism. I mean, Big Bang reforms is you make a list of all the things that are needed, and you somehow try to get it done in 2 years or 3 years or whatever. The approach we adopted, which I think is more sensible, was a gradualist approach, which sort of identifies what are the biggest constraints on the economy today and what are the policy reforms that will give the biggest bang for the buck right now. And so let's get those done. And as you get them done, anticipate the problems that are going to arise later on. I think part of the problem is that, when you're in the middle of a crisis, it's easy to whip up a consensus that you're going to save the country because we're going down the tube. Once it begins to make progress and you're getting good growth, you tend to sit back, and the tendency to anticipate the problems that are going to arise is very difficult to be as successful. I mean, for example, in the 2000s, we had a tremendous burst of growth, partly, of course, a reflection of what was happening in the world economy. And then just as the world economy hit the 2008 financial crisis, we also had the fallout effect of that on our own banking system. Now, banking sector reform is very, very crucial, but it's also something that takes a lot of work to do, and I think we're still working at it. So I think there's some of that. I would say that politics plays a very important role. I mean, I'm in favor of gradualist reforms. But, in my book, I make a distinction between gradualist reform and reform by stealth. I mean, gradualist reform means that you go to the people and say, look, this is what we're going to have to do. It's going to involve a lot of structural change, some pain, but net, we're going to benefit. And this is the way we're going to do it. The other approach is, look, that takes on too many vested interests. So once the crisis is over, you sort of say, I'm going to do it, but you don't have an actual timetable for doing it. You kind of do it as and when it's politically feasible. Now, that is what I call opportunistic reform. I mean, there is a sense that you're going to move in that direction, but the pace at which you're going to move is not clearly laid out. And I think sometimes that becomes reform by stealth. And in my view, for many years, our system did tend to degenerate into reform by stealth. I mean, one of the reasons was that politically, once it's not a crisis, it requires a lot of political commitment on the part of the leadership to keep talking the language of reform and saying, look, we may be growing at 7%, but we got a legal system that is really not anything like being up to scratch, and we've got to change it. So you then take on a lot of vested interests in the judiciary and so on. And I think it requires a lot of political leadership to be clear that this is necessary. Otherwise, you're going to run out of steam.
Well, that's great. You preempted my next sort of question, which was, in a sense, one of the things you say in the book is achieving high growth is not a chance development. It requires deliberate policy steps taken by people with conviction and belief in the need for change. So do you have any advice for reformers? We're trying to reform in South Africa and other countries. What are the key lessons you take from the leadership that was provided in the reform process? And in a way, I think you're saying without that, you might not have been able to lead at below the prime minister, or I'm not sure how to put it exactly. How do you talk to us a bit more about the importance of leadership? What kind of leadership?
Well, I mean, sometimes, civil servants might think that all you need is a competent civil service. And I mean, people who watched Yes, Prime Minister, which is a hugely popular series in India, and I still find myself getting WhatsApps of excerpts from Yes, Prime Minister, and it's quite amazing how relevant they seem to be to any current kind of situation. There's a tendency to think that a competent civil service can do the job. I mean, there's no doubt that you need a competent civil service. If you have an incompetent civil service, you've got serious problems. But I don't think a competent civil service substitutes for political leadership. And the crux of political leadership, I think, is to identify what is the next thing in the pipeline that you've got to do, and to be able to explain to people that this is necessary if you want to achieve the sort of growth rates you talk about, and b, that those who are hurt, you can't avoid them being hurt, but you can ameliorate the pain or look after them a little or produce a kind of a social safety net, build a large enough consensus for change. I mean, I don't think you can ever get change in which everybody agrees with what's being done. But it's possible to develop a support for change in which enough people think it's necessary. During the Indian reforms in the early 1990s, I was then the finance secretary, a civil servant. I used to go to many universities and lecture students on the economic reforms. Now, our kind of established intellectual tradition was very much the old socialist planning, control oriented sort of tradition. And it was quite interesting that I found that before the lecture, I would be meeting the academics. And then after a cup of tea with the senior lecturers, go and meet the students. And I found that every time I met the academics, the senior people, they were deeply suspicious and critical of the reforms. But when I talked to the students, they were actually quite gung ho. I mean, they wanted to see change. They were a bit tired of continuation of the old stuff. And on one occasion, I remember asking the student audience, put up your hands, all of those who are in favor of reform. And, almost 80% of the students put up their hand. So I think you need to engage with students so that they can get a sense that what we're talking about and what we're doing is actually relevant for them also. And I think this also illustrates, nature of benefits. I mean, you can have a person in an industry that is in decline, and if you were very honest about it, you would actually tell that person that, look, there's not much future in your line of work, and we'll try to do what we can. It's not always easy to switch. On the other hand, if the same person believes that his son or daughter are getting good education and might become a software engineer, they would see that some parts of the reform are going to benefit them. Now, these things can't be done by civil servants. These images of inclusive growth or participative growth can only be put across by political leaders, and that's really the role of the political leader. I think the worst thing is for the political leaders to be locked into an assumption that when they're calling for 8% growth, it means every person who's listening to them will have an 8% growth in their income. It won't, because 8% growth means structural change. And structural change means some forms of doing business are going to kind of slowly disappear. The hope is that they're going to be replaced by more productive, higher income, expanding areas of business. And I think politicians somehow have to put that across in a way which becomes saleable.
Great. Let me move to a slightly different topic. There's lots of debate about whether developing countries with lots of poverty should prioritize redistribution or growth. And can you give us a feel of the Indian debate and how you saw the priorities and choices? And then I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on this front.
Yeah, that's always been there. And I mean, a democracy is all about criticism. So whatever the government does, it's a good thing that they're criticized. So when we were pushing for growth, we were constantly being told that you don't care about the poor, you only care about the rich, because after all, growth is going to come through the private sector, and the private sector means the fat cats. They never quite realized that the fat cats cannot do well unless their businesses expand and they create employment, and the employment is not going to be of the fat cats, it's going to be of ordinary people, etc., etc. So I think that we need, our view was that at the level of per capita income that India is, uh, redistribution independent of growth doesn't make any sense at all. We have to have a policy which promotes growth, but the nature of the growth must be such that it leads to benefits flowing down much more than they normally would. But there used to be a tendency that there'll be growth, but there'll be no trickle down. But that is not actually what actually happened. Mind you, we did recognize that the extent of just natural trickle down left only to market forces may not be good enough. So we had a number of programs that were aimed at increasing productivity of those engaged in lower income occupations, especially in agriculture. So the formula that we put out was A, that growth is good, and unless it is in especially capital intensive extractive industries, mining led growth, etc., which can quite conceivably not benefit the bulk of the population, if it's reasonably broadly spread, growth will generate employment and it'll help the poor. So that's one point. The second point was that whatever else we do, agriculture needs to grow more rapidly. So it's not redistribution, but you ought to have a target for accelerating the growth and transformation of Indian agriculture. So pushing agriculture in the hope that that would lead to a generation of income in a much poorer section of the population, that was important. But the third thing was special programs. Now, there's a whole variety of those employment programs to help people in the rural areas get jobs aimed at building rural infrastructure, credit programs for small scale, supporting women's self-help groups through the banking system, a whole variety of these programs. I mean, some of them were good, some of them were not so good, but there were several. And as you said, during India's high growth period, there was a sharp reduction in poverty. Now, interestingly, the political system questioned that. I mean, even within the Congress party, people are not actually happy claiming that poverty has gone down because they fear that, a lot of people would say that you're just preparing yourself for denying us the benefits that earlier used to go to you because you were poor. That was one argument. The other is that you'll be accused of just misleading the people because your poverty line is so low, and what does it matter? All of these were understandable political concerns. But there was not an adequate debate which said that, look, GDP growth has helped. The fact that agriculture grew faster than it did before the reforms has helped, and that these programs have helped. Interestingly, many of the NGOs focused only on the programs. Now, there's no evidence to say that the decline in poverty was only the result of these programs. I think the programs helped. But I have no doubt that if you move from 3.5% growth to 7% growth, and you get a faster growth of agriculture, those two things themselves would lead to a significant reduction in poverty. And these special programs did more of the same. I mean, we've not actually, these are ideally researchable subjects, not only across country, but within the country. I mean, I argued that we ought to do, we should do some research on the decline in poverty in different states and try to explain how much of that was due to growth, how much of that was due to faster agriculture, and how much of that was due to program. Something like that would lead to a better understanding that, poverty reduction is not something which is opposed to growth. It can be part of an inclusive growth strategy. And that was the formula or the slogan that we coined for the 11th plan, inclusive growth.
that's really interesting, the way you've unpacked it. I was looking through a book by somebody I like this morning, and I'm sure you know him, T.N. Nainan from the Business Standard. And he raises a question that I've heard from a number of people, but I wondered if you knew the data or your view on this, that a lot of those programs, the rural employment program or the subsidies for all sorts of commodities, that a lot of those programs actually were captured by middle-class people rather than poor people, and that were less effective in many respects than perhaps the government claimed. What is your perspective on that? Is there data? How do you see it?
Yeah, no, but let me say, all programs are less effective than the government claims, because any reasonable government will overclaim a program. So that doesn't surprise me at all. But I wouldn't say that these programs, of course, the middle class, a very powerful bunch of people. So their ability to grab the benefits or whatever exists should not be underestimated. So sure, they would have grabbed a lot of the benefits. But many of these programs, I mean, for example, the Rural Employment Guarantee Program is not a program that the middle class would want to grab. I mean, it involves hard work out in the fields on a daily wage, and it's not a permanent job. It's 100 days of work per year per person. And actually, even though that's a guarantee, only about 45 days typically is demanded per person. So which suggests that, it's being used by people who need it. And that program, I think, has very little leakage. Many other programs like scholarship programs, etc., yes, they do tend to have a leakage, but that's because the middle class is much more aware of the benefits of school education. What we call the middle class is actually not a very, very prosperous group. So I don't think we don't have, in my view, we don't have a big enough middle class. I mean, to have a democracy that's firmly anchored on a path of inclusive growth, you need an upper class of, say, the top 10%. And then you need a middle class of the next sort of from 10 to 40%, something of that order. And in India, most people who are at the 50 percentile level think of themselves as poor. They don't think of themselves as middle class. So I don't know how right T.N. Nainan is, but mind you, he is actually a very perceptive observer of the Indian scene. So as a general rule, whatever he says is actually well grounded, if not in hard data, at least in a good understanding of reality.
Well, very generous. Let me turn to some other critics. Amartya Sen and some colleagues have written that India has been outperformed on social issues, education and health in particular, by your much poorer neighbor, Bangladesh. How do you respond to this accusation, how it's been interpreted, and what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call it an accusation. It's an assertion, and let me say it's absolutely true that on some indicators, not all indicators, but on some indicators, particularly child nutrition and also primary education, I think Bangladesh has done better than India as a whole, taken as a whole. That's primarily because Bangladesh has done a lot better than the northern Indian states, which don't have the same per capita income as the rest of the countries. I mean, if you divide India up into the better off states in the south and the somewhat more backward states in the north, which is where the bulk of the population is, Bangladesh is not necessarily doing better than the states in the south, but it is doing better than the northern states, whose per capita income may not be very different from Bangladesh. So I think Bangladesh deserves credit for what it has achieved. And to that extent, we ought to be a little more critical of ourselves in that northern belt, that we haven't really done as well as perhaps we should have, as we should have. That's true. But that's something where over time change is actually taking place. And probably what's happening is that the rate of progress in India has differed a great deal across states. And I think a lot of it is also connected with the status of women and education of women and things like that, where I think the North is lagging behind the South big time. But on the other hand, in many areas where the North has lagged behind, it's been catching up also. So,
Great, great. Why do you think education is so hard to fix? South Africa struggles with this. We're one of the worst performers in comparative tables, PISA and others, like India. And it's such a difficult and such a vital issue if we're going to get really increasingly inclusive growth. Do you have any thoughts on why it's so hard? Is it the unions? What is it in your view?
Well, one thing, I guess it's certainly true of India, and maybe it's also true of South Africa, that education is very hard to push for first generation learners. I'm not an educationist, but I know a lot of people who kind of tell me about these things. And a lot of them say that, look, in most situations, a lot of what a child learns is reinforced by the family atmosphere at home. And if a child is being given a sort of education in school where he goes there with books, etc., but comes from a home where the father is illiterate and the mother is illiterate, the child is really not going to be able to catch up. And typically, if they start lagging behind, then they simply lose out over time, because you don't also have a quality of teachers who are actually able to address these issues. Linked to that is the incentive structure. In most Indian states, the education structure is kind of dominated by, you mentioned unions, by organizations or unions of teachers. Most of them view schools have been set up in order to employ teachers and mainly let the teachers do what they think works best. And I think that there's no shortcut here, but it's a much bigger task than we ever realized. One of the important things, and lots of people say that because we have a caste system, which has traditionally excluded a very large number of people from education, we have not, unlike many countries in East Asia, we have not created, if you like, a cultural milieu in which education is really pushed with effectiveness. So many things are at work: state capacity, incentives for teachers, inherent problems with first generation learners. And some of this is changing over time anyway, because my guess is that children coming into school now are coming in from households with a much, much higher percentage of literate parents, and most importantly, literate mothers. It's the literacy of the mother rather than the literacy of the father that is actually crucial. And there, I think we've been slow in making progress in the education of women. So what we're seeing are, 2-decade lags in the improvement in education feeding into the next generation. And part of the problem is money. But I think most people, whenever they say education is not doing well, they say India should spend more on education. I think that's true. We're not spending enough. But merely spending is not going to be enough. It's very easy to hire a lot of teachers and then carry on doing exactly what you're doing. So I've seen a lot of work which suggests that micro-level change is important. And one of the critical things there is making teachers responsible to the local community. Now, this is hugely resented by teachers' unions. Teachers' unions like being viewed as statewide civil servants and not subject to the whims of local, what they would call tin pot dictators in local areas or in the villages, etc. So I think we have lots of lots of tensions to resolve there.
Great, thank you. I want to come back to India as a democracy. CDE is an organization committed to South Africa's democracy, and we've looked a lot at, if you like, the challenge of the authoritarian model in Africa, if you like, and the democratic model. And I wondered if you could, from where you sit in India, how do you see, was democracy an advantage in pushing the reforms and getting some momentum going over the period that you did this? How do you see the China-India comparison, which has been made for a long time as the two models of the so-called authoritarian and the democratic system? What's your perspective on this? And does democracy have any advantages in your view?
No, I certainly think it does. I mean, I don't view democracy, you don't choose to be democratic because you think it's a good way of pushing reforms. I mean, democracy is a more fundamental choice, and what kind of a society do you want to live in? And then becomes a secondary issue that, look, if you want to live in a democracy, could you make sure that it's also conducive to reforms? And I believe that India, at least speaking as an Indian, the issue of not being democratic simply doesn't arise. We are much more diverse than China. 97% of Chinese are Han Chinese. In India, we have innumerable differences across states, religions, languages, etc. So I've always felt that we should never be given credit for being a democracy. We don't actually have an alternative. On the other hand, we can be challenged that, look, since you guys have to be democratic, are you really being a good democracy or not? And all democracies go through new challenges, and you mentioned authoritarian tendencies. That's certainly globally, that has been one of the features of the last 5 or 6 years across the world. A sort of a tendency for individual leaders to loom larger than life, and the old notion of a democracy where you have people debating things in parliament is just receding a little bit. You can have, the essence of a democracy, I think, is whether the government, whether it's run in a presidential form or in a typical Westminster Parliament form or whatever, it is important to have fair elections, which I think we do have. And I think it is important that institutionally, the electoral process cannot be vitiated. And traditionally, people have worried about money power influencing elections. Now, technology is the big question mark, and not just in India. I mean, you hear that in the United States and so on. We all need to be watchful about how all these things will affect the quality of democracy. Coming back to the India-China comparison, I think I don't like the idea of saying China is an autocracy, India is a democracy. India is certainly a democracy. China is a unique example. Let me say, if the test of China is, does its government command a huge amount of support and trust amongst the public, I think the short answer is that it does. It may not be allowing enough freedom of expression. So if you happen to want to be a dissident in China, you have a serious problem. But it's not the case that large numbers of people are being suppressed. On the other hand, the Chinese have found their own way of internalizing multiple views. So the idea of an autocracy where somebody at the very top make some unreasonable decisions, that may not be a good description of what happens in China. I mean, the Communist Party of China, it's a selective type of democracy. It's not a popular democracy, but it is a mechanism where multiple choices, etc., are examined and put through several layers of scrutiny and end up producing good results. And the government, in effect, relies on the good results to in effect legitimize its continuance. And so far, the results have been quite good. Now, mind you, many people who had grave doubts about China's lack of democracy uh, tended to believe that in order to succeed in a private sector led system, the Chinese would have to basically open up and become much more democratic. That has not actually happened. And I think the Chinese don't actually have a high opinion of the democratic process either. I think this is going to be one of the big issues that people have to look at. But you know, the answer is not that autocracy is good. The reason the Chinese manage to do what they do is that they deliver very good results. And the vast majority of autocracies have delivered very poor results. And they've tried to kind of escape from the consequences of their poor performance by more oppression. That's not actually a fair description of what's happening in China. But whatever it is, I mean, I admire what they've achieved, and we should learn a lot from how they go about organizing these things. But that's not the way that India can go. So we have to be democratic.
Great. That leads to my next question, which is Professor Lant Pritchard of Harvard and Oxford has talked about India's flailing state. Is that a fair description of the state, or what did he actually mean?
Well,
let's talk about opening up to markets and the role of markets in the state. How do you see that?
Well, let me respond in two different parts. Lant is one of the most perceptive observers of the Indian scene. And I think it's important to understand what is meant by the flailing state. I think what he had in mind was a state whose limbs are actually not adequately controlled by a mind. But behind that is the notion that the Indian state actually does respond to what are perceived failures. I mean, it's not as if the Indian state sits there in an autocratic way, ignoring what people want and simply going on doing its own thing. Flailing just means that the Indian state recognizes that people want clean drinking water, people want cleaner air, people also want growth, people want better education, better health. And it's kind of a response jerk manner. So in one sense, it's a state that recognizes what's missing, but is not able to organize itself to deliver what is needed. And that, I think, has to do with the concept of state capacity. Now, the same notion of flailing state could have applied to economic growth. You could have said it's a flailing state, it wants high growth, but doesn't know how to get it. That is clearly not what the Indian economy did. I mean, it took on the challenge of high growth, and it demonstrated that it can do reform. We were able to move the growth rate up to 7.5%. Over a 10-year period during the United Progressive Alliance, the average was 7.6%. So that's pretty good, and that's not flailing. I think where I think we haven't done as well is as soon as the people began to take high growth for granted and said, well, what about the quality of growth? What about health? What about education? I think that's been a weakness, clearly, and we've discussed this earlier. And I think that reflects a problem of state capacity. Because, you know, in some of these areas, the solution cannot be found just by letting the private sector do it. I mean, you're not going to get a good health system by simply allowing the private sector to come into. We do allow the private sector to come into health, but it just goes into the higher income needs of health. It doesn't really address and can't address the issues of public health and health of the ordinary person. The same would be true of education. I mean, after all, in the United States, the bulk of school education, the overwhelming bulk of school education is not private. It's actually by local governments. So I think in these areas, we do have a problem. And I think in some of these other areas, like air pollution, environment control. I think we haven't designed the kind of policies that would make people realize that if you really want to pursue some of these things, you have to take some hard decisions. I mean, let me just give you one example. If you're going to give free power to farmers and not charge anything for extracting water, and if 70% of your irrigation is groundwater, you shouldn't be surprised that there's excessive use of groundwater, which is causing soil damage in some parts of the country. But you know, we have not been able to identify it. I don't know how many planning commission or its successor, the Niti Aayog, produced reports saying we've got to do something about it, but it hasn't been converted into a politically acceptable way of reducing these subsidies. That's not to say that it won't happen, but I think we need to. This is where political leadership becomes important. Very few, and this is not a central government matter, this is a state government matter. So typically, most states subsidize electricity to farmers, subsidize electricity to consumers, and overcharge industry, not realizing that that just makes industry uncompetitive. Yet the same chief ministers actually want industry to expand to generate employment and move people out of agriculture into industry. So I think we need this is where political leadership comes in. How do you handle this?
Can I ask you a question? I didn't alert you to this, so you can swat me away if you want. But in your book, you talk a lot about infrastructure and how hard it is, how important it is to move to public-private partnerships or bringing the private sector in, and that the state needs to reorient itself as to how to do this, because you don't want to be taken to the cleaner by private sector companies. On the other hand, you want to bring them into the infrastructure development. Is there anything you'd like to reflect on that?
Well, I think it's very important. I mean, that was one of the big changes made in the course of the reforms. You know, prior to the reforms, most of the infrastructure areas were actually in the government sector, in the public sector. I mean, telecommunications was reserved for the public sector, power generation was reserved for the public sector, railways were in the public sector, etc. Over time, we brought in the private sector into many of these areas. And frankly, it did lead to some success. I mean, the two largest airports in India, that is Bombay and Delhi. I should say Delhi and Mumbai, because Delhi is now bigger than Mumbai. And also the airports at Bangalore and Hyderabad, and some new airports are now private sector airports and doing quite well. And they've taken the load off the government of having to finance all this stuff. There's a lot of such private sector infrastructure that is being built, and the government is reasserting that it's going to do more of that. So it was necessary, because I just don't think that the government would have enough money to build all the infrastructure needed. Our view was that the government would still have to build infrastructure for the poorer areas. But where there's a reasonable revenue model, we can bring in the private sector, and that has worked very well. You know, in ports, for example, when we opened up ports for the private sector development, I mean, initially, some of the minor ports, minor being smaller, were allowed to be privatized, after which some of them have become larger than the major ports. So we started calling them non-major ports rather than minor. We couldn't call them minor because they'd become larger than some of the larger ports. So there have been successes there. But I do think that the problem is that whenever you bring in the private sector into infrastructure, it's a regulated industry. And therefore, they charge whatever the tariff they can charge, or the terms of the concession, etc., have to be transparently worked out in advance. I think the private sector guys very often raise the issue that no contract can anticipate all the problems that would come up in the 30 years of the contract. So very often provisions in the contract need to be altered in the light of changing circumstances. And they found that in the government, whenever such an issue came up, the bureaucracy or the government side was very unwilling to make any change that would be seen as a favor to the private sector. In fact, one of them once said to me that you call it public-private partnership, but I don't see any partnership. I mean, you just give us these contracts and then you sit there watching like a hawk, that we shouldn't make any deviation from the pre-existing terms. And yet the nature of the contract is one we should allow for flexibility. And I think there was a point there. Now, we've had many people look at this and find ways of resolving these disputes. You know, a lot of this has to do with the structure of dispute resolution in government. I mean, government, the same thing comes up in taxation. As you become a more sophisticated society with a greater involvement of both the private sector and the foreign private sector, the quality of regulation, the quality of processes, etc., have to be those that exist elsewhere. You've got to be globally comparable. Now, you know, it's not as if elsewhere they don't run into these regulatory problems. I mean, there have been many cases where, for example, oil concessions, etc., are being clobbered because they do something wrong. The only problem is when that happens in the United States, nobody accuses the United States of being anti-private sector. They just take it as, you know, disciplining big private sector guys that are getting out of line. Whenever it happens in a developing country, it will just be described as anti-private sector, old-fashioned, and so on. So there is a tension. We have to manage that tension somehow. Yeah. But I'm very clear that in the development of infrastructure, certainly for a country like India, India has too much demand for government resources in education and health to be also putting these resources into the development of infrastructure. Best example, because when we opened it up and mobile telephony came in, the great advantage of mobile telephony was that, you know, they would charge you whatever was appropriate, and if you didn't pay, I mean, they just disconnect your SIM. Whereas in landlines, I mean, you know, disconnecting a landline would be regarded as a very anti-people thing. And it's interesting that the mobile telephony expanded hugely, all in the private sector. And people are quite willing to pay whatever is required to keep access going. So I think it takes some time, but we get there.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I have one last big question. I'm going to stretch our time a little, if you don't mind. I want to ask you about affirmative action. When I think about India, it's truly a strange phenomenon that castes in India now want to compete to get into the category of the constitutionally defined other backward castes, so they can get the privileges or affirmative jobs that the most disadvantaged castes in India receive. Now, I understand I'm asking, but I understand it's now more than 50% of the population that are eligible for special quotas in public service jobs and university places and so on. What is your view of this dynamic and this phenomenon? Has this all got out of control now? Because it is really a very strange ambition for people to want to be not a forward caste, as you called it in your book, but an other backward caste. So what do you think of affirmative action? How do you see this? How should one think about it?
Well, I mean, you're right that in India, you know, as long as affirmative action was for a defined group of, let's say, the most discriminated against, what we used to call the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, that was like affirmative action anywhere. But it did get expanded into what was called the other backward classes or castes, and the scale of reservation expanded. I mean, my feeling is that politically, I don't think that the government has much alternatives. Now, mind you, one advantage, when you say people want to get into the category, that really increases competitive efficiency. Because if you've got a bunch of people who have reservations and people who don't have reservations also want to get into that, then the net result of that, it's like making a concession to them. As long as those who have those benefits don't actually object, those concessions will be made. But the net effect will be to increase efficiency, because you'll be, the cost factor will be less binding, because everybody can compete for the general category. I don't think politically, let's say, I would not expect to see much change there. But as long as we're talking about education, I mean, the real name of the game is to expand and improve the quality of education. I think where you run into problems maybe is when reservation becomes a criterion even for promotion within the educational system. And I mean, again, politically, there's very little traction here, but it could be argued that if you're introducing reservation amongst teachers, then in a way you're denying students who have benefited from reservation from having the best teachers. But on the other hand, if identity becomes a factor, you can never be sure whether the net effect of bringing in a little bit of reservation isn't creating a more acceptable, more homogeneous society. So honestly, I can make both, I can see both sides, but politically, I don't see any change here. I think we have to make the best of what we've got and basically improve quality. It isn't there in the private sector. So, since the future, all the good jobs in future are going to be in the private sector, I think it will not hold back competition.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've gone over our hour. We've had, I think, a fantastic contribution from Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and I think you can see why I was so excited that he agreed to talk to us today. I'm going to end with a little story that happened when I was in India, and I managed to get some time with the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, and it was when South Africa had just started its national planning process, and I asked Montek how I should think about this and what can I learn from the Indian experience that might be useful for South Africa. And there was quite a long silence, and then Montek smiled and he asked me a question and said, well, how many priorities does Trevor Manuel have in his National Development Plan? And I said, well, we've counted and we think we're at about 123 and rising. And I probably don't remember, but Montek laughed and he said, well, I'm down to 25 for a population of 1.3 billion, which I thought was interesting from a very different perspective. Thank you very much, everybody. Montek, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for giving us this time and such a rich set of insights into India, your experience, and how you see that country. We could have gone on for another hour, but it was not my contract with you. So thank you very much indeed. Everybody, we will be producing a summary of this discussion, which will be widely distributed, and we'll do that as soon as we can. Thank you for joining us today. Montek, I don't know if you want to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne. And I have one request. I see that in your questions and answers, there must have been a lot of questions posed. And if you could send me by soft copy those questions, some of which you may not have posed to me, it would give me a sense of what the audience really wanted to know, which I may have missed. But that would be very helpful. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. It's great being with you. And as I was saying to you earlier, all of us developing countries need to know a lot more about each other. So I hope you'll have more such interactions with other developing countries, including, of course, India.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll certainly try and send you the Q&A. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
everybody. We are now closed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Montek, thank you very much. It was really fabulous.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good. Good. Okay, great. We'll be in touch. We'll send you the draft document and the Q&A.
Okay.
And, great.
Lovely. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.